Hey everybody, welcome along to this video where I'm about to break down the horror of migrating well over 80,000 records in DynamoDB. Alright, cool. As I mentioned, uh, I updated about well over 80,000 records in DynamoDB. Firstly, I would just like to mention that I think I've used DynamoDB quite extensively over the last 3 years, 3 to 4 years. It's usually been my primary database, and just a little breakdown for those of you that don't know what DynamoDB is. Essentially, it's a NoSQL database. It's serverless and it has almost limitless scalability. And Amazon themselves, or on Prime Day rather, every year they've got amazing stats on the amount of records they're able to write per second, and that number just keeps increasing every single year for Black Friday or Prime Day in the States. So in terms of limitless scalability, that's definitely guaranteed. Also, in terms of the serverless context, it's just such a lovely database to get up and running and build a POC and build a product with, because essentially, it's like a couple of lines in the CDK and then poof, you've got a table that you can just write to. But obviously it has its pitfalls, being that, it encourages single table design as well. And then also when it comes to just doing joins on data, if your modeling isn't correct rather, you're going to have a big time. And then there's also comes the topic of migrating data for analytics or data into like a data lake or data warehouses. And look, Amazon have done amazing work over the last couple of years to get DynamoDB into a state where there are lots of zero ETL related features for like OpenSearch, S3, Redshift, and the likes. So if you haven't used DynamoDB or you want to understand a bit more, there is a blog post version of this video which has links to various stuff to get you started on DynamoDB. But nonetheless, let's dig in. Cool. So what was I trying to do exactly? So I had three different tables. They all had about 90,000 K records, or more than 80,000 records inside those three tables. And more specifically, those tables were storing email related data. But the whole cause of me having to update all those records was that the TTL was invalid. So you might be wondering, what is TTL? That's just basically the time to live. So basically, essentially, you can give DynamoDB a property, and then essentially what it will do is it will look for that property, and you can set it as a TTL, and it will then delete those records on a particular time period. But obviously, we had made the mistake of setting it to milliseconds, so meaning we had exponentially extended the amount of time that those records, those emails, were going to live in the in DynamoDB. So as you can see here from the screenshot, we just got a simple table here. So this is from the console, and essentially what we got going here is that you can set the TTL in the CDK or in via the CLI, or you can do it in the console. So as you can see, just about like over here, this is where you see the TTL is unavailable because this was in dev, but in prod, essentially, we had set that TTL to be milliseconds, essentially. So basically, it's a timestamp that when you determine that this item is no longer needed. So the whole task was to essentially update this TTL for all those records across three different tables. Right, so let's imagine a scenario where I work at Meta on the Instagram team, right? And Mark Zuckerberg is like, hey, Amo, you've got like well over 100,000 posts that have not been deleted for some particular reason. And I'm like, hey, Mark, boss man, I know why. That's simply because the TTL in the table is set to milliseconds. And then, Mark's quite a smart guy, and he probably knows the answer. And he's asking me, how can this be solved? And I simply just tell him straight up, look, if we set the set to expire, which is our TTR property, and update it, with a custom script, I think it should solve the problem of getting those posts deleted. And then, I mean, he knew already from the time that he asked me this question that most likely I'm going to need all the luck in the world to make sure I can do this law date or migration, as you will, carefully. Cool. So, what are the first things you're going to need to do to get this done correctly? So, first thing I did was basically I downloaded all the data to my disk, basically to my Mac. Just, you know, in dev at least first before going to prod, and I'll explain a bit later how we went about updating or downloading the data in prod first. Cool. So essentially, download all the data. Pretty simple. So there are multiple ways you can go about it. You can either go into the console and keep going page by page, but that's not quite efficient. So essentially, we just had a script that did a scan and dumped all the records into a JSON file, essentially. And then, usually, if your table is partitioned well and it's got GSIs, you could use a query, which will save you a bit of money. And so, as you can see here, I've got a simple asynchronous function, and then on line 12, I've got a primary key and a sort key, and then the primary key is just a mixture of the post owner ID and then the post type ID, and then the sort key is the date created. And essentially, I want to filter on the primary key and make sure the sort key is within a particular date range. So this is how I would do it if, we wanted to return posts from a particular point in time and not return everything in the DB. So yeah, if your table is partitioned correctly, you can utilize the query functionality, and then you'll be able to basically do some queries that save you a bit of money, which you'll still need to also paginate through these records, but this is a lot cheaper than scanning the table. As well as if you partition this correctly and say in the same table I've got posts, but I've also got users, and then I could also store likes linked to posts. I could do that all in one table without having to scan the table through all the posts, through all the likes and all the users, essentially. And another example, which is the inefficient route, would essentially be a scan, where basically you pass in the filter expression. So in our case on line 6, we're basically saying, hey, find all the records in the table that don't have this property, that do not exist, and in our case it was set to expiry, and then essentially you just do a scan. But if you just do a scan like this, you're not going to return everything inside the table because it's naturally paginated. So to do that, you've got to create like a recursive function that will basically just help you scan through the table recursively. And the way you do that is you've got to supply a exclusive start key, and then basically tack on the last evaluated key. So every time you scan through a page, it will probably be like 25 results or whatever the case might be. And then essentially you're like, okay, cool. What's the last ID that Dynamo gave me? I'm going to make that the next start key. Simple pagination that you'll just go on and then recursively call the table till everything is essentially returned back to you, and then you've got all the data. And then as you can see, I've got some stats on line 16 and 18 to basically tell me, cool, how many items have I scanned, and then what's the percentage completed, essentially, because you do want to know if you're doing like more than 5,000 records, the script is going to run for like over 20 minutes, most likely in some cases, if you're lucky, or could go a bit longer. I think in production, the script ran like just under 45 minutes. We ran into a few issues where we realized we were doing something wrong, and then we had to start the script again. And this is for over 3 tables. So I think it was a very extremely late night trying to get this over. So these 2 lines are going to help you a great deal if you don't have them. So, just have them there so that you at least know. To get the item total, I just cheated and then just copied the item total from the console. I mean, you could write a query and use the SDK to query the table stats if you wanted to do that and be a lot more complicated. But yeah, I just try to keep things a bit simple. Cool. And then essentially, once you've paginated through everything, I would then just advise writing the files to disk, basically, essentially. Or if you've got more of a complex way, you can transfer all those records into like a data lake of some sort or somewhere else that you want to probably run the script on, like a virtual machine or like a Lambda, whatever the case might be. But essentially, in our case, thank God it was not like, or wasn't like a consumer related table where consumers users are using this table every day, where I'm pretty sure the records will be well over 500,000 and close to the millions. So in this case, we just opted to write the data into a JSON file and then onto disk, and kept it pretty simple. So cool. We've now gone through the process of downloading everything, and then essentially your update script is going to look very similar to everything else. Let me just go back here. Your update script is going to look very similar to this, where essentially you're just going to pull in all the records and then update them. And then in the blog post, I go a bit more into detail about how to update everything. But it's pretty simple. You're going to set the time to the TTL rather into seconds, and then you're just going to update everything. And you'll do the same thing, have percentage stats or records completed as well, so you know how long the migration's going. So bear in mind there's the way to download all the data, and then the way to update all the data back into DynamoDB. Cool beans. So yeah, migration checklist, very important for planning. This is also important to just help keep stakeholders informed, you know, especially if you're working on more of a critical table. Because like, remember in this case, we were just storing emails. We weren't storing anything fancy or like anything critical. So it's like a back office process, and those emails are not important for people to make, or for customers even to make decisions, or the system to make decisions on them. So yeah, this migration checklist will go a long way, but also helping keep you sane. Cool. So first step of your checklist is identifying when is the right time to actually run this migration or update. So these things might seem pretty obvious. You'll say, hey, no, this is pretty obvious, but trust me, doing migrations or updates, whatever the case might be, you're just so busy focusing on the problem, you're super stressed, and people are putting pressure on you to say, hey, when is this thing? This thing needs to be done, as in like, 2020, 2021, whatever the case might be. But, come on, give us a break, So to give yourself a break, if possible, try to identify, a low window of traffic. If not, then that's just, that's just the probabilities you have. And I mean, to put it quite frankly, you're screwed. So good luck doing that carefully. And then also, I mean, if you've got an application, that's used by people in different time zones, so just make sure that, the migration or the update won't impact people. So like users and staff in different time zones as well. Very, very important to keep a hold of that. And then essentially, so in our case, we were fortunate enough that we could run the migration like after 8 in the afternoon. So I think we started around 8, and then we only finished like 10, 10:30 to 11 in the evening, with like a tiny bit of mistakes. And I mean, I think every migration or update I've done in the past, it always goes over, and you're always going to bed late nonetheless. Cool. Next thing is make sure you've got PIT enabled on your table. So this is just point in recovery. Messed that up. Point in time recovery. There we go. So make sure you've got PIT enabled. This will just help you roll back the table if you've made a mistake. And I'd also just recommend running your scripts aggressively in dev multiple times. So like keeping a copy of the corrupted data, running your script, nuking the DB, making a new one, putting the corrupted data back in, and then or if you so desire that you just want to go back to a previous state as well, instead of nuking everything, you can just do that as well. And then you don't have to re-upload all the data back, all the corrupted data back. And then also, if something does go wrong in production, you can easily just roll back and push the migration off to another day once you've resolved whatever bug is causing you to not complete the migration. And then another thing is you should be able to determine whether there's some possibility of backwards compatibility. So by that I mean, is there some way within the backend that you can update the records as you go along, or in the front end, can you write a little hacky script on the front end that will format some of the properties when the data comes through? If not, then I mean you've got to do the migration. But it also just depends from a product perspective. Like, is this tech debt that you want to pay now or pay later, and is it all worthwhile? To run to rather have a fix that's backwards compatible. But just bearing in mind that later down the line, these things will always catch up with you. But it all just depends, like in your organization, what's your outlook on these type of things, But this is a bit of a silver bullet if people don't want to go down the migration route and have that stress, and if you guys are just pumping with data like by the second and you just can't afford to take a risk or even spend time or dev time on such a problem, then backwards compatibility, determining if there's a backwards compatible change that you can make either on the server or on the front end, then poof, go for it. Cool. So there you have it. Those were some of my that was some of my experience using DynamoDB, or rather updating multiple records at a time in DynamoDB. If you've got any other, let's say, alternative suggestions, then please hit me up in the comments or on the blog post as well. And if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button, give us a little like and a comment, and share the video with other people that might be interested. Nonetheless, it's been a pleasure. Once again, I've been Amol, and I'll catch you lot in the next one. Cheers.